The street turned into a roaring stream, mud and debris rushing like a beast unleashed. At the edge, a German shepherd clung to the curb, soaked and shaking, her leg trapped in the storm grate. She didn't bark, she cried out, high and desperate, as two newborn pups whimpered in a floating basket behind her. The flood pushed harder, her eyes froze. Then, through the rain, came a man. No coat, no hesitation. He stepped into the water and reached for her. What happened next would change not just her life, but his and an entire town watching in silence. If you believe some cries should never go unanswered, like subscribe and stay with us. In the northern hills of Willow Creek, Oregon, where the pine woods sloped into narrow lanes and time seemed to curl in the mist like smoke from a chimney, autumn had not arrived gently. By late afternoon, the storm rolled in, trailing wind that howled through the branches and rain that fell with the cold insistence of memory. The sky had turned an iron gray, low and brooding, and the street outside Tom Harlan's small wooden cabin was already a shallow river of leaves and gravel. Tom, a man of 60, stocky and broad-shouldered, despite the soft slump of age in his back, sat in the dim of his living room, wrapped in a heavy flannel shirt and staring absently at the dying fire in the hearth. His face, weathered and unevenly shaven, held the quiet stillness of someone who had grown used to long silences. The years had not been kind, but they had not been cruel either. They had simply passed, like snowmelt in spring. Once long ago, Tom had worked in wildfire zones, volunteering during dangerous summers up north, driving supply trucks, clearing fire breaks, anything to help. He never spoke of it much, not even when Ellie was still alive, but the knowledge of danger and how to face it quietly had never quite left him. Tom had lived alone for 7 years, ever since cancer had taken his wife Ellie, a woman with laughter always in her eyes and stubborn warmth in her hands. Her absence had never left the house. It had only changed form, settled into the corners, lingered in the chipped coffee mug by the sink, and curled itself around the rocking chair no one else sat in. Outside, the wind snapped at the porch, and the tin gutter rattled against the eaves. Tom stood, intending to close the storm shutters for the night, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to rain or timber or wind. It came once more, thin and long, a drawn-out cry that threaded through the storm like something wounded and ancient. At first, he thought it might have been a trick of the wind, or a fox too close to the road, but then it came again, slightly louder, soaked in urgency. Despite the layers of weathered pine in the cabin walls and the thrum of rain on the roof, the sound sliced through the space like a whisper from behind a closed door. It was not just a cry, it was a calling. He paused at the door, hand on the knob, frowning. For a heartbeat, he considered ignoring it. He had ignored many things since Ellie died. Birthdays, holidays, phone calls from nieces in Bend. But this sound unsettled him in a way that felt too familiar. He opened the door. The wind slapped his face immediately, cold and raw. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the lane that led toward the narrow culvert between the willow trees. And then he saw her. A dog large, with wet black and tan fur matted to her ribs, paws scrabbling at the edge of the pavement as she clung to the mouth of an open storm drain. Her eyes, golden and wild, locked with his just as a swell of water pushed against her flank. Behind her, a soggy cardboard box bobbed in the floodwater, wedged against a trash bin. Inside, 2 small pups cried, no more than days old, barely visible but shivering violently. The mother, some kind of German shepherd, maybe 3 or 4 years old, let out another cry, guttural and hollow. She was not calling for help. She was calling farewell. Tom's legs hesitated on the porch step. He took one backward glance at the warmth of his cabin, the fire barely alive, the silence so comfortably familiar. A part of him wanted to step back in and shut the door, to let the world rage without him. You don't owe anyone anything anymore, he whispered to himself. Then he saw Ellie's blue scarf still hanging on the peg by the door, untouched for years, the fringe frayed at the end from when she used to worry it with her fingers. And in that moment, it was not the dog's cry he heard, but her voice. If it were me, he thought suddenly, you would have gone already. He exhaled, turned, and plunged into the storm. The water was ankle-deep and icy. He waded across the street, heart thudding not from fear, but from the sharp rush of something he hadn't felt in a long time, purpose. The shepherd snapped her head toward him, but didn't growl or shy away. She looked too tired, her paws bloodied from scrabbling the rough pavement, her chest rising and falling with heaving effort. With a grunt, Tom crouched beside her and reached for her front leg. It was wedged tightly between two iron bars near the drain. He tugged gently, murmuring words without knowing them. The dog whimpered, but didn't resist. After a second pull, her leg came free. She crumpled, falling into his arms with all the trust of something that had no other choice. He carried her first, cradled across his arms like a child, and laid her gently under his porch awning. The pups, one darker than the other, mewled pitifully from their floating box. Tom waded back through the water, scooped up the entire box, and hurried it to the porch. The cardboard was soggy, near collapse. One of the pups, the smaller one, shivered violently, his breathing thin and uneven. Tom didn't think. He just opened his flannel shirt and pressed the pup against his chest, skin to fur, warming the tiny body with his own heat. Back inside the cabin, everything became motion. He laid towels by the hearth and stoked the fire until it came back to life. He dried the dog with Ellie's old scarf, his hands careful and slow. She did not resist. He whispered something under his breath. He didn't know what. Perhaps her name, though he didn't know it yet. He placed the pups beside her, wrapping them in a fleece throw he'd never used. The larger pup, whom he would later call Max, latched onto his mother's belly. The smaller one, Scout, struggled, wheezing faintly. Tom found a syringe left over from a long-forgotten first aid kit and fed Scout drops of warm broth by the fire. It was quiet, save for the wind and the rain and the soft sound of breathing slowly returning. That night, long after the storm had passed and the streets began to steam beneath the moonlight, Tom sat on the floor of his living room, back against the couch, 3 lives curled in sleep beside him. He reached for a notepad from the drawer and wrote one line across the top. She came with the rain, and the silence she broke wasn't hers, it was mine. Morning broke slowly over Willow Creek, diffused through a fog that seemed reluctant to lift. The storm had passed, but it left the world sodden and quiet, as if even the trees needed time to breathe again. Outside Tom's cabin, the pine needles clung to the gravel driveway like scattered relics, and the wooden porch groaned gently under the weight of moisture. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace lingered like a held breath. Tom hadn't slept, not really. He had dozed off at some point in the armchair, his flannel shirt still damp from the night before, one hand resting lightly on the makeshift bed of towels where Luna lay curled, her breathing slow but steady. The 2 pups had shifted slightly during the night. Max pressed tight against her belly, and Scout nestled in a fold of the fleece throw, his tiny ribs rising with the rhythm of recovery. Tom looked at them as if unsure whether they had been a dream or something real, 3 lives brought into his solitude like fallen stars. He stood slowly, joints stiff from sleep in awkward angles, and walked to the small kitchen nook that had once been Ellie's kingdom. She had made it hers, not with renovation, but with ritual. A different dish towel for each season, herbs hanging from the window frame, and a coffee mug she never let anyone touch except him. That mug still sat there, chipped along the rim, faded sunflowers on its side. He reached for a kettle and began boiling water, not so much for tea as for the comfort of something warm. As he passed the hallway, he paused by the linen cabinet, pulling out a knitted scarf the color of rust and pine. He held it briefly to his face, lavender. The scent was faint now, but still there, woven into the fibers by years of use and love. Without thinking, he returned to Luna and laid the scarf over her hips. She stirred, but didn't wake. Later that morning, a soft knock came at the door, quick and deliberate. Tom opened it to see a woman standing there with a woven basket in her hands. Grace Miller, his neighbor from 2 cabins down, was in her late 50s, with silvering auburn hair tied in a loose braid, and a frame both wiry and upright. She had the kind of presence that settled into a room without asking for it. Years ago, she had been a music teacher in town, but after losing her son during a flash flood 6 autumns ago, she'd retreated from public life, turning to her garden and her collection of herbal remedies. She was not unkind, but her voice always held a quiet edge, as if joy was something she had once held too tightly and now feared would break. Grace stepped inside without ceremony. Her boots left wet prints on the wood floor, but Tom didn't mind. She set the basket down on the table. "Some eggs," she said simply. "The hens are restless again." Tom gave a small nod. She had always been like that, bringing something by, quiet and timely. Then her gaze drifted toward the hearth, and she stopped. Luna lay curled on the towels, her breath shallow. The pups shifted slightly beside her. Grace didn't speak at first. Her eyes stayed there for a moment, unmoving. Then she turned to Tom. "What happened?" "Found them in the storm," he said quietly. Grace drew a slow breath, then stepped forward. Her boots tapped softly on the wood as she crossed the room. She set the basket aside again, then knelt beside Luna and examined the dog's paw, unwrapping a strip of towel that had gone damp. Her hands were practiced but gentle, like someone tending a wounded bird. After a moment, she pulled out a small jar of calendula salve, a cloth bundle tied with dried thyme, and a thermos. "For her hips," she said, not looking up. Then, after a glance at Tom, "I brought some warm bone broth, too. Thought you might all need it." Tom nodded, unsure of what to say. He had known Grace in passing waves from the porch, nods in the grocery aisle, but never anything like this. That afternoon passed in a rhythm new to Tom. He cut wood while Luna slept, then returned a spoon broth into Scout's tiny mouth. Max had begun to crawl more, dragging his round belly across the rug, making small squeaks whenever Tom moved too far away. At one point, the pup gripped the hem of Tom's jeans with soft teeth and refused to let go, eliciting a breath of something dangerously close to a laugh. It had been a long time since anything in this house made him laugh. Later, Tom sat on the floor, Scout curled in his lap, and tried to hum a lullaby he only half remembered, the one Ellie used to hum when the power went out. The melody stumbled, but Scout's breathing slowed and his eyes closed in sleep. As twilight painted the windows with a pale orange hue, Tom prepared a small plate of bread and butter for Grace, who had returned with more herbs and a bottle of diluted antiseptic. They ate on the back porch, where the wind still carried the scent of pine and old rain. Neither said much. Grace, who had once spoken in crescendos and allegros, now preferred silence, and Tom, who had built his world out of it, respected her language. Only once did she speak of the past, mentioning how her son had once rescued a wild rabbit, only for it to die 2 days later in his arms. "But he said it mattered," she added, "because it didn't die afraid." That night, Tom couldn't sleep again. He moved between the pups and Luna, checking their breath, their warmth, adjusting blankets. The firelight played on the walls, dancing among shadows and memory. As he laid down another log, his hand brushed against the tin box where Ellie had kept old photographs and pressed flowers. He didn't open it, not yet. But he kept it near. The wind rattled the window once as if testing it, but the house held. Outside, Willow Creek slept beneath a pale moon. Inside, something had shifted, not loud, not sudden, but certain. The cabin, once a hollow vessel of habit, now pulsed with breath and life. In the quiet between Scout's whimpers and Max's gentle pawings, Tom heard something else, too. The subtle return of his own heartbeat, steady and unafraid. The cold crept in like an old regret, seeping beneath the doorframe, curling into the corners of the cabin. By the time dawn pushed against the frost-laced glass of Tom's kitchen window, Luna had stopped eating. Her breath was still there, faint, shallow, but she no longer lifted her head when he approached. The pups remained pressed to her belly, unaware, still suckling in trust and warmth. But Luna's eyes were distant, and her body trembled even beneath the blanket. Tom moved through the house with a clumsiness he hadn't known in years. It was not the stiffness of old bones, but the weight of helplessness. He tried coaxing her with broth, held the bowl close to her nose, hoping the scent might pull her back. Nothing. He dimmed the lamp near the hearth, drew the curtain to soften the light, and sat beside her. One hand rested lightly on her side. "Don't go the way Ellie did," he whispered under his breath, fingers curled in the quilt. "Not you." Outside, sleet tapped at the windows, and the sky was the color of unspoken things. When Grace arrived mid-morning, she stepped in with urgency. Her face was paler than usual, her braid pulled tighter, and her coat was still dusted with ice. She knelt by Luna without a word and pressed her fingers gently to the dog's ribs. After a long moment, she looked up. There was no panic in her eyes, only insistence. "She needs more than we can do here." Tom stood motionless, hands in his pockets. His truck had not left the driveway in months, and the thought of driving in this weather made something twist in his chest. He hadn't driven in a storm since Ellie's last night, the night she collapsed in the kitchen, the ambulance unable to arrive in time, That guilt had fused itself into him like a second spine. But this wasn't Ellie. This was now. Still, his legs felt rooted. Grace straightened, her eyes drifting again to Luna. She stared a moment longer, something unreadable in her face, then turned slowly toward Tom. There was a softness at first, a tired disappointment, and then her voice, quiet but unyielding. "You get to decide," she said. "But if you walk away from this again, you don't get to say it wasn't your fault." That was what moved him, not the threat of death, but the chance, however, small not, to carry another ghost. Tom pulled on his coat. The truck was reluctant, coughing twice before the engine finally held. Luna was wrapped in the old quilt from the reading chair, Max and Scout placed in a shallow box on the passenger seat. Grace stayed behind, promising to prepare herbs and keep the cabin warm. The drive down the icy back road was slow and tense. Each bend brought a flash of old memory, headlights slicing through pine trunks, the world too bright and too narrow all at once. But Luna whimpered once in the back seat, and that was enough to ground him. She was still here, not yet gone. The Pine Brook Animal Clinic sat at the edge of town, tucked between an old bakery and the post office. The windows were fogged, the front porch piled with salt buckets and a rusted shovel. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar. A wind chime over the door jingled softly as Tom entered, carrying Luna in his arms, the pups bundled against his chest. The front desk was empty at first, until a tall young man appeared from the hallway. Dylan Rhodes was barely 30, with sandy hair that never quite obeyed his comb, and a face that held the softness of someone who hadn't yet grown tired of being kind. He wore an oversized fleece vest over his scrubs and walked with a slight limp and old motorcycle injury, they said, from the days he volunteered at shelters in Montana. Dylan didn't ask questions. He only nodded and gestured toward the back. Tom followed, wordless, as they laid Luna down on a padded table. The light above them was clinical, but Dylan's hands were not. He moved with quiet confidence, listening to her chest, checking her gums, inspecting the trembling limbs. "Fever's high, could be an infection from exposure. She's dehydrated too." Tom hovered nearby, clutching the box with the pups, unsure of what to do. Dylan turned briefly. "We'll give her fluids, antibiotics too, but she'll need rest and time." Time. That word rang hollow and full all at once. As Dylan worked, Tom glanced around the room. On one wall were photos of rescued pets before and after shots, names handwritten in careful cursive. On a side table was a small stack of pamphlets about healing trauma in animals and children alike. There was a bulletin board filled with crayon drawings from local kids. One showed a dog with wings. Another had a house with hearts coming out the chimney. Dylan glanced at the pups, then paused as his eyes settled on a photo tacked near the light switch. An older dog, eyes sunken, ribs visible in the before image, and beaming in the after, flanked by 2 children and a woman in scrubs. His gaze lingered for a second longer than necessary. "You should write it down," he said quietly. "The whole story." Tom frowned. "Why?" Dylan looked back at Luna. "Because some people need proof that it's not too late to begin again." That night, back at the cabin, the fire crackled stronger than it had in days. Grace had left a note on the table, along with fresh broth and a small envelope of lavender. The pups slept curled together on a heated pad Tom had found in the attic, their bodies rising and falling in rhythm. Luna lay nearby, her body thinner but warmer, wrapped in the quilt as if it had always belonged to her. Tom sat in his old rocking chair, the one Ellie used to favor, and stared at the yellowed pages of a notebook he hadn't touched in years. After a moment, he picked up a pen and wrote one line. "She came through the storm and made me remember I'm still here." Snow had begun to gather along the edges of the porch railing by the second week of November, soft and slow, like time that forgot to hurry. Willow Creek lay beneath a sky of quiet steel, the kind that held its breath before a heavier snowfall. In Tom's cabin, the fire no longer felt like a borrowed comfort. It had become part of the rhythm again, woven into mornings of slow movement and nights of small rituals. Luna had regained her strength in fragments, her breathing deeper now, her eyes more alert. She still moved cautiously, her gait uneven, but there was focus in the way she watched her pups, as if counting every breath they took. Max had grown bolder, tugging at the frayed edge of a rug and wrestling with his brother. Scout, though smaller, had developed a stubborn will, dragging his back leg awkwardly as he followed his sibling across the cabin. Tom had taken to calling out soft encouragements. Not words exactly, just sounds, half hum, half sigh. The kind a man made when he wasn't used to sharing his space, but found himself reluctant to be alone again. The kettle whistled one afternoon, while Tom stirred a pot of oatmeal laced with shredded chicken and broth for the pups. As he reached for the wooden spoon, he caught himself circling the pot counterclockwise. He paused. Ellie had always done it that way, said it kept the bottom from burning. Left for luck, she'd joke, even though she didn't believe in such things. Tom smiled, barely. The smell of ginger and cinnamon filled the kitchen scents he hadn't used in years, tucked away in a box above the stove, now opened, now breathing again. That night, he found the old writing desk under the stairs, coated in dust and cobwebs, a drawer slightly warped from years of disuse. He cleared it off, oiling the hinges with care, and laid out paper yellowed with age. It wasn't a decision, not really. It was more like gravity. He wrote without knowing what he meant to say, only that the words came from a place that had been sealed too long. Ellie, the first letter began. If you could see what's happened here. The words followed without punctuation, like a river finding its path after drought. He didn't write to explain, or confess, or seek anything. He wrote because something in him still reached for her, and because saying it aloud to a house that had forgotten how to echo wasn't enough. Grace visited often now, never with ceremony. She would knock once, then open the door as if it were her own. She brought tinctures for Luna's joints, paw balm for the pups, and dried rose hips in cloth pouches. Grace no longer felt like a neighbor. She belonged to the space, the way sunlight belonged to the east window. One afternoon, as Tom prepared to tuck another letter into the biscuit tin, where Ellie had once kept thread and buttons, Grace walked in with a box of paperbacks and a grocery bag filled with sweet potatoes. She placed them on the counter and glanced at the papers beside him. "Writing again?" she asked, but not sharply. Her voice was soft, worn at the edges. Tom nodded. He didn't offer them to her, and she didn't ask. Later, as they shared a plate of roasted vegetables and leftover stew, Grace mentioned a flyer she'd seen pinned to the co-op board at the post office. "The library's holding a winter storytelling night," she said. "People are reading aloud, old journals, letters, family histories. They're calling it the Fireside Project." Tom stirred his stew. She didn't push, only added, "No one was born to carry silence all their life." Tom didn't respond, not then. That evening, while Max slept in a knot against his chest and Scout gnawed determinedly on the corner of an old slipper, Tom reread one of the letters he'd written. The paper was smudged where he'd rested his hand too long, the ink blotting slightly. The letter wasn't polished. It wasn't even finished, but it held something truer than anything he'd said aloud in years. He folded it once, then again, and slipped it back into the tin. A few days later, Dylan stopped by. He wore a puffer jacket too thin for the weather, and a beanie that didn't quite cover his ears. His gait was off from the ice, he didn't complain. He carried a small parcel of vitamins for Luna and a donation envelope from the clinic's outreach fund. They spoke mostly about the dog's weight gain, progress, Scout's limp. At one point, Dylan knelt to check Scout's paw, and Max climbed onto his thigh with reckless affection. Dylan laughed genuinely, then glanced up at Tom. "These two are going to need space soon," he said. "You ever think about building something bigger?" Tom looked down at the pups, one nestled, one climbing, then back to Dylan. "I guess I might have to," he said quietly. Dylan nodded once, then shifted his attention back to Scout. As Dylan stood to leave, his eyes wandered briefly across the room and caught on something pinned to the wall. Grace had taped one of the library flyers near the door, alongside a photo of Luna and the pups curled together. Nearby, a children's drawing of a dog with wings fluttered from a magnet on the fridge. Dylan looked back at Tom, then said, "You should write it down." The whole story. His voice was softer this time, not a suggestion, but a recognition. Tom didn't reply, but something in him had already heard it. The letter writing continued. Tom wrote in the early mornings before the frost thawed, and sometimes after midnight when the house held its breath. The letters were private. Not because they contained secrets, but because they weren't for anyone else's understanding. In them, he spoke of the day Ellie planted lavender in the rain, of how she always cut toast diagonally, of how he'd forgotten the sound of his own laughter until Max made it surface again. One evening, as snow fell thick enough to muffle the trees, Grace left a book on the front steps. No note. Just a bookmark placed at a story titled The One Who Stayed. Tom read it twice before dawn. The story wasn't about him, but it felt familiar in a way that unsettled him, as if someone had written down what he hadn't yet admitted. He sat by the fire for a long while, the book resting open on his knees, eyes unfocused. When he finally moved, it was to reach for a fresh sheet of paper. This letter wasn't addressed to Ellie. It began, "I didn't know I was still capable of change." From the window behind him, the soft glow of the kitchen light spilled outward, catching the frosted pane and shimmering faintly in the dark. It wasn't the flicker of a dying fire anymore. It was a steady light. One bright enough that someone passing by might just stop to see what lived inside. The snow had thickened in Willow Creek, softening the world into silence. Roofs were lined with white, trees drooped under the weight of it, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and cold iron. Tom's cabin stood quiet but alive, the smoke from its chimney curling steady into the morning sky. Inside, the days moved with the same fragile rhythm as breath, each moment filled with quiet tasks, each hour marked by small miracles. Luna had begun eating more. Her coat had regained a soft sheen, and she now followed Tom slowly around the cabin, her head held just high enough to remind him she hadn't given up. Max and Scout grew bolder by the day. Max had discovered the thrill of chasing dust motes, while Scout, though still limping, had taken his first wobbly steps across the wooden floor. They wrestled beneath the kitchen table, barking in squeaks, falling over themselves with the joy of not knowing fear. Then came the note. It was left under a rock on the porch, torn from a notebook, written in quick, hard letters. "You shouldn't keep sick dogs around kids. You don't know what they carry." No name, no signature. But it didn't need one. The paper was anonymous, but unmistakably targeted. Tom could feel it, words whispered behind produce bins, glances that lingered too long in the hardware aisle. A delivery driver who left the package at the edge of the gate instead of the porch. He didn't say anything to Grace, not right away. He only folded the paper and placed it in the bottom drawer of the old writing desk, beneath the letters he had yet to finish. She didn't ask about the letters again. She didn't have to. It worsened that weekend. A group of teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, walked past the cabin at dusk, their breath rising in clouds. Tom was stacking firewood when he heard them. The taller boy, lanky with a red hoodie and the careless gait of someone unused to consequence, called out, "Hey, is it true you're keeping dying animals in there?" The girl giggled. The second boy said nothing, just kicked snow toward the gate. Tom didn't answer. He only turned slowly, his expression unreadable. They moved on quickly, but the words stayed behind, embedded in the air like frost on glass. That night, Tom didn't write. He fed the pups in silence, checked Luna's paws for cracking, and stood a long time by the kitchen window, watching the street. He considered what it would take to pack them up, find another place, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one asked questions. He'd done it before, vanished, moved through grief like mist. But something in him hesitated this time, not from fear, but from the knowledge that leaving would mean returning to that deeper silence, the one he had only just begun to emerge from. The next morning, Grace arrived early. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, eyes bright with purpose. She carried a folded newspaper and a thermos of lemon balm tea. Without asking, she poured a cup and placed it in Tom's hand. Then she showed him the paper. Inside was a short letter to the editor, unsigned, but clearly aimed. It warned against irresponsible pet care in residential areas and potential threats to public health. There was no name, but the phrasing, the timing, the tone, both of them knew exactly who it was about. Tom's hand tightened around the cup. Grace sat across from him and said nothing for a while. Then she spoke, low and steady. "Let them whisper," she said. "They have no idea what healing looks like. We do." Later that evening, Tom stepped into the town hall for a local community meeting. He hadn't planned to speak, but when the topic turned to safety and sanitation, his name surfaced softly, then louder. He stood, clearing his throat. "I served in wildfire zones. I know risk. I wouldn't bring it into a place I call home. These dogs aren't a threat. They're survivors. And they're mine." That afternoon, something shifted, but not all at once. It began with a bag of dry food left at the gate, wrapped in a grocery sack with a note scrawled in marker, "From MC Baxter, used to have a shepherd too." Then came the bundle of old towels, a box of vet supplies, 2 wooden planks leaned against the fence. Tom found them one by one over the next few days. No one rang the bell, no one knocked. A man in a navy coat walked by without stopping, but left a can of antiseptic spray on the porch. Another neighbor, a woman with a sharp chin and arms crossed tight over her chest, stared for a moment, too long, then turned away, but came back the next morning with a sack of rice left neatly by the stairs. The silence that had once surrounded the cabin began to change shape. Dylan came by with a roll of insulation and helped Tom measure boards for a proper kennel. Grace brought her nephew, Theo, a quiet, broad-shouldered young man with dark hair and a gentle way with tools. Together, they cleared space behind the woodshed and began framing a structure. Scout hobbled after them, barking once each time a nail went in. On the 4th day, a woman stopped by. Her name was Miriam Dean, late 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair and a cane wrapped in floral tape. She ran the bookstore in town and had once volunteered at the shelter. She didn't stay long. She handed Tom a blanket embroidered with paw prints, said her late husband would have loved what he was doing, then left with tears in her eyes and a peppermint tucked behind her ear. The dogs felt it too. Luna stood longer by the window now, watching the street not with fear, but with curiosity. Max had taken to sleeping at the threshold of the half-built kennel, his head resting on a length of unfinished wood. And Scout Stubborn, scrappy Scout, could now walk from hearth to door without stopping. Tom timed it once, laughing under his breath when the pup tripped over a shoelace and kept going. One evening, as twilight slid across the snow and turned the world lavender, Tom sat at his writing desk. He reached for a pen, his hand slower than usual, and pulled out a letter he'd started days before. The final line came easier this time. He wrote, "You used to call me the quiet man. Tonight, I think I'm ready to speak for something worth loving." And he paused, then looked out toward the kennel to the faint flicker of a porch light someone had left for them. Speaking wasn't just about writing anymore, it was about staying. It was about standing still in the face of noise and choosing not to run. The snow had begun to melt in soft streaks down the sidewalks of Willow Creek, revealing patches of earth beneath the tentative skin of a town inching toward spring. Icicles hung like punctuation from the roof of the town library, dripping steadily into puddles that reflected a sky the color of worn denim. Inside, the reading room had been rearranged. Rows of folding chairs now faced a small wooden lectern beside a bay window framed by yellowing curtains. A banner above read in faded serif font, "Stories from Our Town." Tom arrived early. He wore a plain wool sweater and pressed jeans, his boots still damp from the walk. Grace had offered to drive him, but he had declined. He wanted to arrive on his own 2 feet, however unsteady they felt beneath him. Luna padded beside him, her gait measured but proud, the faint scar on her side barely visible beneath her thickening coat. Max and Scout followed behind, playful and unaware of what the day meant, nipping at each other's tails as if the world held nothing but delight. The woman who greeted them at the door was Marion Holt, the head librarian. She was in her late 60s, tall and lean, with a spine like a ruler and hair pinned into a tight gray bun that never seemed to loosen. Her smile, though not frequent, was genuine, and her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived a life shaped by pages. Marion had spent most of her adult years cataloging not just books, but the private milestones of others' birth announcements, obituaries, graduation photos clipped from local papers and tucked between volumes. She had once dreamed of being a historian, but her husband's death early in their marriage had redirected her path inward into community and curation. "You'll speak after the children's story time," she told Tom, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Not too long, just enough." Tom nodded, his mouth dry. He took a seat in the back while a group of young parents gathered near the front with toddlers on their laps. The children giggled and wriggled as Miss Ivy A., bright-eyed 20-something, with an armful of picture books and a lanyard of enamel pins, led a story about a traveling hedgehog. Tom barely registered the plot. His fingers rested lightly on the folded pages in his lap. He had rewritten them 3 times that week, then stopped rewriting altogether. Some words, he had decided, were meant to be delivered imperfectly. When it was time, Marion walked to the front and adjusted the microphone. "Today," she said, We have someone with us who knows that stories aren't always found in books. Sometimes they arrive in boxes on stormy nights. Sometimes they growl. Sometimes they heal. She turned, motioning. Tom Harlan has something to share. There was a rustle of coats and a few murmurs as Tom approached the lectern. Grace sat near the front, hands folded over her knees, her gaze steady. Next to her, Max and Scout curled at her boots like sleepy bookends. Luna lay beside the podium, as if she'd always belonged there. Tom looked out over the room, then down at the first line of his paper. He didn't read it. Instead, he spoke. "I didn't save these dogs," he began. His voice trembled. "They saved me, from a house too quiet, from a heart that had stopped wanting." No one moved. He went on, not with the fluidity of a practiced speaker, but with the weight of someone who had lived each word. He spoke of the night Luna arrived, the storm, the note left on the porch, the slow return of noise to his home paws tapping across the wood floor, small whines and tail thumps in the morning. He told them about Scout's limp, Max's mischief, and Luna's quiet strength. "They didn't come into my life as a second chance," he said, "but they became one." When he finished, there was a stillness before the room exhaled. Marion stepped forward with a soft smile and offered a nod of thanks. A few people approached afterward, quietly, respectfully. One man in a flannel jacket squeezed Tom's shoulder and murmured, "Lost a shepherd myself, 4 winters ago. Thank you." A teenage girl with a camera asked to take a picture of the dogs for the library's bulletin board. Toward the end, a woman approached carrying a square object wrapped in brown paper. She introduced herself as Helen Barber, late 50s. Short, wiry, with wind-chapped hands and a no-nonsense coat that suggested she preferred action over conversation. She worked part-time at the feed store, where her late husband had once built kennels for the town. She didn't speak much, just pressed the bundle into Tom's hands and said, "Someone made this for me once. I think it's time I passed it on." Then she turned and left. Back home, Tom unwrapped the parcel on the porch steps. Inside was a wooden sign, hand-carved, stained a warm oak color. The words etched into it were simple, almost too soft for the weight they carried. "Be the miracle someone is waiting for." He ran his fingers over the grooves, then held it out so Grace could see. She didn't say anything, only smiled, then knelt beside Luna to scratch behind her ears. That evening, the cabin felt different, not louder, but fuller. Max barked at a moth caught in the porch light. Scout had discovered the echo of his own footsteps and was chasing them from room to room. Luna dozed near the threshold, eyes half-lidded, as if keeping watch had become her instinct. Grace made tea in the kitchen, humming tunelessly as she stirred. Tom sat by the window, watching dusk settle over the pines. On the table beside him, a half-written letter lay open. He didn't reach for the envelope. For the first time in months, he didn't need to seal it. The words were still unfolding. Outside, the wind had quieted, and the roof no longer creaked under the weight of what had been. Out on the porch, the carved sign hung beneath the lantern, swaying gently as if whispering back all the things the house had once forgotten. Sometimes, the ones we think we're saving are the ones saving us. In a world that moves too fast, a single act of kindness can become someone's turning point. Have you ever rescued someone, or been rescued in return? Share your story in the comments, like this video, if it moved you, and subscribe for more true stories that remind us what really matters.